They spent $50 million to build a drilling rig on his fence line. They laughed as they sucked a fortune in oil from right under his feet, calling him a broken old man. But they didn't realize they weren't stealing his oil. They were actually working for him for free. For 3 months, the billion-dollar corporation pumped 5,000 barrels a day, thinking they were hitting the jackpot. It wasn't until Barnaby walked into their glass tower headquarters with a yellowed scrap of paper from 1934 that the CEO realized his entire company had just become the old farmer's unpaid employees. Barnaby Thorne stood on his porch, his boots coated in the fine red dust of Hollow Creek, Oklahoma. In his hand, a mug of coffee went cold, ignored. The horizon, once a jagged line of oak trees and rolling hills, was now dominated by a steel Titan. The rig was a skeletal tower of gray metal, crowned with a flickering gas flare that stained the night sky a hellish orange. The noise was constant, a low-frequency thrum that shook the glass in Barnaby's windows and the teeth in his head. He had farmed this land for 40 years. His father had farmed it through the Great Depression. His grandfather, Ezekiel, had claimed it when it was nothing but buffalo grass and wind. For 4 generations, the Thorne family had bled for this soil. They had survived droughts, locusts, and the predatory banks. But they had never faced a monster like Titan-Crude Resources. A white SUV polished to a mirror shine tore down the dirt track, stopping inches from Barnaby's porch. Sterling Vance stepped out. He was a man who didn't belong in the dirt. His suit was charcoal silk, his shoes were Italian leather, and his smile was a calculated insult. He looked at Barnaby's sagging barn and rusted tractor with the pity of a man looking at a dying animal. "Still here, Mr. Thorne?" Vance asked, leaning against his car. He didn't take off his sunglasses. "I thought by now you'd have packed up. The noise alone is enough to drive a sane man to the city." Barnaby didn't blink. He stood perfectly still, his back a straight line against the wooden pillar of the porch. "The land was here before the noise, Mr. Vance. It'll be here after." Vance chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. He pulled a leather-bound folder from the back seat. "I like your spirit, truly, but spirit doesn't pay the bills. I'm authorized to offer you one last inconvenience fee, $50,000. Just sign this waiver agreeing not to interfere with our horizontal drilling operations. We're already 3,000 feet under your north pasture. The oil is flowing, Barnaby. It's leaving your land, and there's not a thing you can do to stop it." Barnaby looked past Vance toward the rig. He could see the massive vibration of the drill string. He knew they were using directional drilling to bypass his property lines, sucking the black gold from the Thorne family reservoir while technically sitting on state-leased land across the fence. "I own this land," Barnaby said quietly. "You own the surface," Vance corrected, his voice growing sharp. "In 1930, your grandfather sold the mineral rights to the state to save this farm from foreclosure. The state sold those rights to us. We own the deep, Barnaby. You just own the dust on top. Take the 50,000, buy yourself a nice condo in Tulsa, because by next month I'm putting 2 more rigs on that line. You'll be living in the middle of an industrial zone." Vance tossed the folder onto the porch steps. It landed in the dirt. He didn't wait for an answer. He climbed back into his climate-controlled SUV and sped away, leaving Barnaby in a cloud of grit and silence. Barnaby didn't pick up the folder. He watched the taillights vanish. Then he turned and walked inside, his heavy footsteps echoing on the oak floorboards. He went to the kitchen, moved the heavy rug aside, and pulled a brass ring set into the floor. A trap door groaned open, revealing a flight of stone stairs that led into the darkness of the cellar. The cellar smelled of damp limestone, aged kerosene, and the weight of a century. Barnaby clicked on an old metal flashlight, its beam cutting a yellow path through the darkness. This was the roots of the house, the place where his grandfather, Ezekiel, had hidden the family's meager valuables during the Great Depression. In the corner, beneath a stack of rotted burlap sacks that had once held seed corn, sat a heavy iron trunk. Its surface was pitted with rust, the padlock frozen shut by decades of oxidation. Barnaby didn't look for a key. He went back upstairs, grabbed a heavy pry bar, and returned. With one steady, powerful thrust, he snapped the lock. The metal shrieked, a sound like a dying animal, and the lid creaked open. Inside, the air was dry, preserved by a thick lining of cedar wood. There were old photographs of men in flat caps and women in high-collared dresses, their faces grim and unyielding. Beneath the photos lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Barnaby's hands, though large and rough, moved with surgical precision as he unwrapped the package. He found it, the original deed and the 1934 mineral transfer agreement. He sat on an old wooden crate, the flashlight propped up on his shoulder. He began to read. Ezekiel Thorne hadn't just been a farmer. He had been a man who spent his winter nights studying law books by the light of a flickering lamp. He had known that the state was desperate during the Dust Bowl, hungry for any asset they could tax or seize. Barnaby's eyes narrowed as he reached the third page. The ink was faded, a ghostly brown, but the words were unmistakable. Ezekiel had been forced to sell the mineral rights to settle a massive tax debt, but he hadn't sold everything. The clause was buried in a paragraph about subsurface easements. It read, "The grantor hereby conveys to the state of Oklahoma the rights to all solid combustible minerals, specifically coal and lignite, for the purposes of public relief. However, the grantor specifically reserves and retains for himself and his heirs in perpetuity all rights to liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons, including but not limited to crude petroleum and natural gas, discovered or undiscovered." Barnaby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. Titan-Crude Resources had bought their lease from the state. The state had looked at their records from 1934 and seen a mineral deed. In their modern, digitized haste, they had categorized it as a total transfer. They hadn't looked at the fine print of a handwritten document from 90 years ago. They had assumed minerals meant everything. But in Oklahoma law, a specific reservation overrides a general grant. The state only owned the coal under Barnaby's land. They never owned the oil, and if the state didn't own it, they couldn't lease it to Sterling Vance. Barnaby folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right against his heart. He didn't run out to the rig. He didn't call the sheriff. Instead, he walked back upstairs, made himself another cup of coffee, and sat back down on his porch. He watched the rig. The massive drill string was spinning, humming with the power of $1 billion investment. Every second, it was sucking hundreds of gallons of crude from the Thorne family's reservoir. Barnaby pulled out a small pocket watch, another gift from Ezekiel. He began to time the cycles. He knew the law. If a company drills on land they don't own, it's called good faith trespass if it's an honest mistake. They might only have to pay a small royalty. But if they continue after being put on notice, or if their negligence in checking the title was gross, it becomes bad faith conversion. In that case, the company isn't allowed to deduct a single penny for their expenses. They have to hand over 100% of the gross revenue. Barnaby checked his watch again. He decided he wasn't going to say a word. Not yet. He wanted them to build more. He wanted them to pump more. He wanted every cent they spent on pipes, labor, and diesel to become an involuntary gift to the Thorne estate. For the next 3 weeks, Barnaby became a ghost on his own land. He watched from the shadows of the barn as Titan-Crude brought in more equipment. They installed a massive battery of storage tanks, 12 of them, each capable of holding 400 barrels. They laid a high-pressure pipeline across the pasture. They were preparing for a long, lucrative harvest. Sterling Vance visited one more time, his SUV splashing through a puddle of mud and spraying it onto Barnaby's mailbox. He didn't even get out of the car this time. He just rolled down the window, tossed a fresh set of legal threats onto the gravel, and shouted, "The offer is down to $20,000 now, Thorne. Clock is ticking." Barnaby didn't even look up from the fence post he was mending. He just tightened a wire, the metal biting into his glove. He was a patient man. He had spent 40 years waiting for rain. He could wait a few more days for justice. On a Tuesday morning, Barnaby Thorne put on his Sunday suit. The heavy charcoal wool smelled of cedar and hard winters. He polished his work boots until the scuffs of 40 years of farming were hidden under a layer of dark, stubborn wax. He tucked the leather briefcase, the one his father had used to carry the farm's debt papers, into the passenger seat of his rusted Ford F-150. He drove 200 miles east toward the glass and steel canyons of Oklahoma City. The headquarters of Titan-Crude Resources was a jagged monument to ego. It stood 60 stories high, reflecting the clouds like a giant, cold mirror. Barnaby looked out of place in the lobby. He was a man of red clay and sun-bleached wood, standing on white marble that cost more than his entire life's work. He didn't lean on the polished reception desk. He stood back, his hands clasped behind him. "I'm here to see Sterling Vance," Barnaby told the receptionist. His voice was a low, dry rumble that seemed to stop the chatter in the room. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her eyes tracing the deep lines on his face. She looked at him with the polite pity one reserves for a relic of a bygone era. "No," Barnaby said. But tell him I've brought the invoice. Tell him Barnaby Thorne is here to collect." 10 minutes later, he was ushered into the executive boardroom on the 34th floor. The room was a sanctuary of mahogany and silence. Sterling Vance sat at the head of a table that could seat 20. He didn't stand. He didn't offer a hand. He just leaned back, his charcoal silk suit perfectly pressed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Barnaby, I'm impressed," Vance said, checking his gold watch. "I didn't think that old truck of yours could make it past the county line. Have you come to sign the waiver? I'm afraid the offer is down to $10,000 now. Every day you wait, the price drops." Barnaby walked to the window. He looked down at the tiny, scurrying cars below. "You've pumped 420,000 barrels of crude from under my north pasture, Sterling. I've timed the trucks. I've logged the pressure." Vance laughed, a sharp barking sound. "We've been through this. We have the state lease. You own the surface. We own the deep. You're talking about your oil, but it hasn't belonged to a Thorne since the Great Depression. You're just a ghost haunting a hole in the ground." Barnaby turned slowly. He opened the briefcase. He didn't pull out a stack of papers. He pulled out one single laminated sheet. He walked to the table and slid it across the mahogany. It looked small and insignificant in the vast room. "My grandfather, Ezekiel, was a man of specifics," Barnaby said. He knew the state was hungry in 1934. He knew they wanted the coal to fuel the steam engines. So he gave them what they wanted. Vance's smirk remained as he picked up the paper. He began to read, his eyes scanning with practiced arrogance. But then his pupils dilated. The color drained from his face, leaving it the shade of wet ash. His hand, manicured and soft, began to tremble. This wasn't in the title abstract," Vance whispered. The abstract was a summary. "My grandfather's deed was a reservation." Barnaby's voice was as cold as a winter wind. "He sold the solid minerals. He kept the liquids and the gases. He kept the oil, Sterling. And since you didn't check the original ink in the county basement, you've been trespassing in bad faith for 90 days. Vance looked up, the smirk replaced by a frantic, hollow stare. "We can settle this." "A royalty agreement, backdated." "No," Barnaby said. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across the terrified executive. "Under Oklahoma law, bad faith conversion means you don't get to deduct a single cent of your $50 million investment. You owe me the gross value of every barrel. And you're going to pay me for the privilege of keeping your equipment on my land. Or you can start digging for coal, because that's the only thing you have the right to touch." Barnaby picked up his briefcase. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out of the room, leaving the titan of industry shivering in his glass tower. Barnaby didn't wait for the elevator to reach the lobby before the first frantic phone call came. His old flip phone vibrated in his pocket, but he didn't answer. He knew it was Vance. He knew the panic was currently spreading through the 34th floor like a wildfire in a dry canyon. He walked out of the glass tower, the heavy humidity of the Oklahoma afternoon hitting him like a physical weight, and climbed back into his Ford F-150. He drove away from the city, leaving the skyscrapers behind, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the red earth. By the time he reached the dirt turnoff to Hollow Creek, the sun was beginning to dip below the oak trees. As he pulled into his driveway, the constant, maddening thump-thump-thump of the rig was still there, but something had changed. There was a fleet of white SUVs parked along the fence line, their amber lights flashing. Men in hard hats were scurrying around the base of the derrick like ants on a disturbed mound. Barnaby sat in his truck for a moment, watching. At exactly 6:42 p.m., the sound changed. The deep guttural roar of the diesel engines sputtered, groaned, and then, for the first time in 3 months, fell silent. The sudden absence of the noise was deafening. The gas flare, which had been a constant, angry torch against the sky, flickered and died. A week later, the legal hammer fell with a weight that shook the entire oil industry. Titan-Crude's own legal team had confirmed the validity of Ezekiel Thorne's 1934 reservation. There was no loophole. There was no escape. Under the bad faith conversion doctrine, the corporation was ordered to pay Barnaby the gross market value of every barrel extracted, totaling $42 million. Because they had failed to conduct a proper title search of the original county records, the court ruled they could not deduct the $50 million they had spent on the drilling rig, the labor, or the infrastructure. Sterling Vance didn't just lose the case, he lost his career. The board of directors at Titan-Crude, faced with a catastrophic quarterly loss and a PR nightmare, fired him before the final settlement was even signed. His reputation as a closer was incinerated by the fact that he had been outplayed by an old man with a piece of paper and a flashlight. Barnaby didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a fleet of new cars. He stayed in the house Ezekiel had built. He used a portion of the money to pay off the mortgages of 6 struggling families in the county, and he set up a scholarship for local kids who wanted to study agricultural law. One evening, as the crickets returned to the north pasture, Barnaby sat on his porch. The drilling rig was gone, dismantled and hauled away like the bones of a defeated invader. The land was quiet again. He looked at the red soil, realizing that while the corporation had seen a bank account, he had seen a legacy. He pulled the old 1934 deed from his pocket one last time, smoothed it out, and then folded it away. The earth had kept its promise, and Barnaby Thorne had kept his. The news of the Thorne reservation hit the industry like a seismic shock. Within 48 hours, Titan-Crude's stock price plummeted. Investors scrambled, and the state's mineral board issued an emergency stay on all production in Hollow Creek. Back at the farm, Barnaby sat on his porch, watching the chaos unfold. The white SUVs were no longer racing past with arrogance. They were crawling, their drivers avoiding his gaze. The massive rig, once a roaring beast of progress, began to slow. The gas flare flickered and died, leaving the night sky to the stars for the first time in months. Sterling Vance tried one last time to save his career. He drove to the farm himself, no longer in the polished SUV, but in a rented sedan, his silk suit wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. He didn't even make it past the gate. Barnaby stood there, his shotgun resting across his arm. Not aimed, just present. "We have an offer, Barnaby," Vance shouted from the road, his voice desperate. $100 million. Total buyout. You can own the city. Just sign the release. Barnaby didn't move. He didn't blink. "You're on my land, Sterling," he said, his voice carrying through the wind. "And the land doesn't want your money. It wants its piece back." The legal battle was short and brutal. Titan-Crude's lawyers knew they were beaten by the ghost of Ezekiel Thorne. Under the law of bad faith conversion, the corporation was ordered to pay Barnaby Thorne the gross revenue of every barrel extracted, over $90 million, without deducting a single cent for the cost of the rig or the labor. Furthermore, because the infrastructure was built on land they had no right to occupy for oil production, a judge ruled that the equipment now belonged to the landowner as a penalty for trespass. Barnaby Thorne became a billionaire overnight. But the lottery effect didn't change the man. He didn't move to a mansion in Tulsa. He didn't buy a fleet of cars. The first thing he did was hire a local crew to dismantle the rig. He watched as the steel Titan was cut into pieces and hauled away. He paid for the soil to be remediated, for the grass to be replanted, and for the scars on the earth to be healed. Then he went to the local bank in Hollow Creek. He didn't walk in to deposit his check. He walked in to buy every outstanding mortgage on the surrounding family farms. He handed the deeds back to his neighbors, free and clear, with one condition: keep the land. And read your grandfather's will. He funded the local school, built a new medical clinic for the county, and established a scholarship for children who wanted to stay in agriculture. A year later, Barnaby stood in the north pasture. The grass was tall again, waving in the Oklahoma breeze. The only sound was the lowing of cattle and the distant song of a meadowlark. He walked to a small, shaded grove of oaks where Ezekiel Thorne was buried. He placed a hand on the weathered headstone. "It's quiet again, Grandpa," Barnaby whispered. The oil was still there, deep in the dark. It would stay there. Barnaby had realized that some treasures aren't meant to be dug up. They are meant to be guarded. He was no longer just a farmer. He was the warden of a legacy, a man who proved that in the face of billion-dollar machines and silk-suited thieves, a single piece of paper and the courage to stay silent could move mountains. Barnaby turned and walked back toward the house. His boots were dusty, his hands were scarred, and his heart was full. He sat on his porch, picked up his cold coffee, and watched the sun set over a horizon that was finally, truly his. Barnaby Thorne's story is a testament to the power of patience and the weight of a legacy. It reminds us that knowledge is the ultimate weapon against those who think they can buy the world. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and grit, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with someone who believes in the power of the underdog. What would you do if you found a secret in your family's past? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet heroes and hard-won justice. Until next time, keep your land and keep your word.